Et je voudrais proposer des éléments de réflexion.
I have a few elements for reflection, food for thought.
Qui ont dit aujourd'hui dans les pays, disons, francophones, la Shoah
related to what is called the Shoah by gas and Shoah by bullet, an expression mainly used in French-speaking countries, but both notions have been promoted in the media in the course of the year after the year 2000, and at least in the French-speaking countries, the terms, these notions are widely used. And it seems that there's a very strict distinction there, like as if there were a Shoah by bullet and a separate Shoah by gas. Now, Father Dubois has done a lot of research into that. We had a presentation, interesting presentation yesterday from one of the historians from his team, and he is the one who launched these terms. I'm going to try and speak as slowly as possible. I've struck a deal with the interpreters. I haven't given them my presentation beforehand, so I'll now talk a bit more slowly. So first of all, the central role of Auschwitz in the entire story of the Shoah. We know that Auschwitz as a place of remembrance, and also a place where national remembrance and national memory is built. Auschwitz has become a crucial milestone in European and worldwide education. But when we have a look at the historical events and the chronology of the Shoah, we should take into account, we should focus and zoom in on the central role of Auschwitz. And first of all, there's three issues related to that. Chronologically, the central role of Auschwitz is clear if the departure point is the Wannsee Conference, January 41. That's when Auschwitz gets its central and dramatic role. But when we think of the Shoah that occurred in the countries in the East, and when we then use Dubois' terminology, we'd have to call it the Shoah by bullet, then I think the first who described this process didn't call it the Shoah by bullet. It was Dubois who invented that term, and I'm referring to the study published in France of Leon Polyakov. He was able to study the documentation during the Nuremberg trials. It was published in 1951 in France. I don't remember the exact title. It's quite a famous title. But anyway, so the date. And it all has to do with the central role of this place of remembrance and the creation of some sort of an identity. Then a second issue has to do with the number of victims, and a third issue has to do with the origin of the victims. When the big factory, as you could put it, started working in 43, you should remember that there's a transition, that has been a transitional stage, that Auschwitz was built in various stages, and 1943 is a key date. 2/3 of the Jewish victims had already been killed by 1943. So, if we should, we can attribute a central role to Auschwitz around that period, and even starting in January 1942. This is, of course, just food for thought. This is not a certainty. And then the origin of the victims, we always explain the pupils when we visit Auschwitz or the Birkenau area and the forest and of Birkenwald. Then we tell them these are the cemeteries of the Jewish community from the countries from the East. But Mr. Janos already pointed out it is mainly Jews from Hungary, Italy and Greece. And also, they should bear in mind that the bulk of the Ostjuden, so the German Jews, had already been eliminated by that time. But what I find even more interesting is the mental map which has led to this central role being attributed to Auschwitz. And that's why I like to quote one of the authors. It's an Italian author. He works in France. He's called Enzo Traverso. But in France, of course, they put the stress differently. There he's called Enzo Traverso. I'm going to quote him. And of course you can always dispute this point of view, but his point of view has had a big success, and I'm quoting him. The text is called "The Nazi Violence, a European Genealogy." So already it refers to the idea of a genealogy, which has its roots in European colonialism and which will lead to European colonialism within Europe, with the death camps and the work camps. And this book was published in France in 2002. The title is La Violence Nazie, and he says Auschwitz, therefore, thanks to its industrial processes, represents or shows close ties to a factory, as proven by its architecture, its chimneys, its barracks, which are symmetrically located, and also its location within or at the heart of an industrial area. And then production and extermination are closely correlated, as if the massacre, so the gas chambers of Birkenau, are just one particular form of production, just like the production of synthetic rubber for whom Auschwitz III had been created. can be considered to be similar. So this is quite a classical approach. It reminds us of the School of Frankfurt. And then there's another author who's contributed in the 80s to this idea of modernism. It's a Polish sociologue. He lives in England. Wigmund Bauman is his name. Very famous work. Modernité et locaux, that's the French title. And he focuses on the bureaucratic elements. So he talks about the industrialization of this genocide. But that was only possible because it was underpinned and supported by a massive bureaucracy. Berlin stood for bureaucracy. They had stamps and documents and plenty of bureaucracy. But as we take distance from Berlin and we get to the scene of the crime, I have the impression that the bureaucracy is no longer that relevant, but something else comes instead, and that's the barbaric acts. And this idea of bureaucracy as a sort of expression of modernism, which manages to perpetrate this mass crime. But that, to me, is one of the most convincing criticisms of Bauman's book. It was written by Yehuda Bauman. The text is available in France. And I'll quote from the text. We could, based on Bauman's description, we could assume that the machine was modern and well-oiled, but that was not the case. Often it was inefficient, not working, full of contradictions, and it had occupied a role within the Nazi regime, many Nazis tried to use it to their own advantage. Let's now focus on this whole idea of the genocide system. We already mentioned yesterday, in another context, the opening of the Russian archives was crucial for Shoah research, because then we could study unknown documents, and there were also many studies and a whole range of historic literature that had been developed in the East, and notably in Russian in the course of the years. And in the years 2000, two studies were published, one of Yaltman, a Russian researcher, and then the major study of Irzel, and was then published in the States, at the Nebraska University Press, and it's on the Shoah in the Soviet Union. And when you read those texts, and when you read the numbers there, we get a completely different image of the Shoah compared to the descriptions we'd received in the years before that. The estimates differ, but they range between 2.5 and 2.8 million victims just in 1943. So that's before Auschwitz was fully operational. And it was in the most barbaric of ways. namely shooting, Shoah by bullet. But what was that, this Shoah by bullet? Well, it was an act of barbarism. Yesterday we've seen already a part of it, but we have to try to understand this better. And it's a very complex scene, because the actors are really improvising. You have the executioners, and then you have a second category of executioners, and that's the local police. But they do occupy a central role. So in the field, and depending on the various countries, there's an ethnic faction that is collaborating with the executioners, the German executioners. And they manage all the practical items. Yesterday it was explained eloquently. They have to take into account the changes in the front line, first months of August, so in rather spring and summer 41. That's when the front line stabilized. And that's when those groups could move in. So we already have two categories on the executioner's side, and then there's the spectators, the bystanders. And that was also brilliantly explained by a presentation held in Germany at the end of the previous century. It was the crimes of the Wehrmacht, and it showed a large quantity of private pictures. So Wehrmacht soldiers who shot that footage. There was there were plenty of comments. So it was basically a carnage, a slaughtering with bystanders. And then there was a fourth category. We tried to understand that yesterday the people who were requisitioned, who were commandeered, so who were forced to participate, these young farmers, and the footage in the documentaries is quite extraordinary. Martin Dean carried out a number of studies, especially in the United States in the early years 2000, on the participation of the local inhabitants, the Schutzmannstaffel, let's say auxiliary police in Belarus and the like. There too, there's a genocide within a war waged against the civilians and the Jews. One of the major works on the Shoah, Lucy Davidovit's The War Against the Jewish, published in the United States a few years ago. And it's really a war against the Jewish. And later on I'll get back to this concept of waging war against civilians. But this war against civilians is turning into a genocide launched by the special forces, the Einsatztruppen from the Nazis and their police collaborators. But it was also some sort of ethnic cleansing. It's an inter-ethnic war, which is underpinned by this genocide. It's very complex. every new wave of invaders launched his own program and started killing people. So it was a genocide, a genocidal wave, which basically resembled a civil war. It's not a coincidence. If you look through a satellite and you watch Europe via Google Maps, and there's two areas full of mass graves. So that a part of Europe which is really full of mass graves. And then there's Spain. So there's also a civil war took part in Spain against the civilians, and it's not a coincidence. In the year 2000, I participated in a seminar on mass graves in Europe, and it was very interesting to see how history repeats itself in the shape of mass graves. And this association, Spanish association, para la recuperación de la memoria in Spain, is basically doing the same. They are looking for mass graves from the Guerra Civil, the civil war, based on eyewitness statements. Because the Spaniards didn't have the type of bureaucracy the Germans had. So what is this shooting, this Shoah by bullet? Well, there's a very famous quote, popular with all the historians when they talk about the episode 41-42 and the genocide and the genocide of the Ostjuden. And it's when in August 41 Himmler visited Minsk. It's highly controversial also amongst historians, because that's Reitlinger. So Reitlinger and Hilbert, they dedicate 3 pages to it. It's almost a novel. And I'm going to quote him. Hilbert says that Himmler was assisting a shooting of about 100 people. That's for sure, because it was marked on the Dienstkalender, so the service calendar of Himmler, as kept in the Russian archives. And after assisting that, there was a moment of weakness. And von den Bartelewski, the highest-ranking official or officer present in Minsk, says to Himmler that they have to stop the shooting because the shootings are too strenuous for the shooting squads. So it's too hard on them. And Walter Stahlecker, the head of one of the Sonderkommandos, and he says, he calls it selige Anstrengungen, so let's say mental strain. Mental strain with the executioners. They start having issues with killing the victims. And that has to do with the position taken by the executioners, because they were looking the victims in the eye. This reconstruction is now often questioned, but in Hilbert's description of this event. It's Basilevsky who says that they have to find another way for carrying out the extermination. And we know that the same day, the same afternoon, Himmler issues an order. He orders his generals to find other methods and carry out tests. And that's when the idea pops up of the gas. They so to say, discover gas, even though gas was already being used in Germany and also in Poland. After the fall of Poland, gas was used in special operations in 1940. But the gassing system is a clean system. It's an industrialized system. It allows the executioner to be far away and he doesn't have to face his victim anymore. Because at one point there was repulsion. They found it repulsive to have to handle and touch corpses. There was a text that was published in France, quite remarkable on that. It's a precise analysis of the psychological effect and operational effect of this. They talk about repulsion. The executioners therefore have to keep some distance from the victims, and they have to introduce a third category, some sort of a gray area. So a third category, somebody who just has to handle the corpses. And such is the case at Kölno, Sobibor and Treblinka in the framework of Action Reinhardt. It also works in the shootings. It's always requisitioned farmers who have to handle the corpses in order to create some distance between the executioners and the victims. And that distance was created more particularly by the Sonderkommandos. The requisition peasants actually carried out the same task as the Sonderkommandos later on. I'll finish here. We ended with the brutalization, and we finished here with some sort of an organization. And I'd like to finish with a quote from the executioners, Gitta Sereni. She unfortunately died last summer. She's written one of the most final texts I find on this whole issue. She's Jewish, and she spent time with Stangl, one of the biggest criminals in history. It's a quote from an executioner. My apologies for that, but it's very important. So, the 28th August 41, Stangl arrives, new commander of Treblinka camp, and he describes the following to Gitta Sereni. She had been, and she describes his arrival in this modern factory. I came by car with an SS driver. The smell, you could smell it from kilometers away. When we crossed the railroad, at about 15 minutes from Treblinka, we saw corpses, 3, 4, and then even more. When we got to the train station, there was hundreds of them. They were exposed to the heat for days. There was a train full of Jews, some dead, some still alive, and they seemed to have been there for days. So this is end of August 41. Treblinka was the most horrible and frightening thing I've ever seen in the whole of the Third Reich. And Gita puts his head in his hands and he says, this is Dante's Inferno reenacted. So it's not the this is basically the terrorist factory that is often being referred to.